The first thing I said when the CEO looked at me across that corporate dinner table was something I never planned to say out loud. Not in a room like that. Not in front of people like them. And definitely not in front of my wife. But what happened next is exactly why I remember every second of that night so clearly. My name is Ethan Walker, and I still remember the sound of glassware clinking under soft golden lights at the Westbridge Hotel ballroom in downtown Chicago, where Olivia had brought me that evening like an accessory she wasn't quite sure how to introduce anymore. The room was filled with executives in tailored suits, conversations layered with confidence, and laughter that always seemed to belong to someone else's world. I stood beside her, holding a drink I barely touched, while she adjusted her posture the way people do when they want to look like everything in their life is exactly where it should be. But I could feel it immediately, the distance between how she saw me and how everyone else in that room might interpret me. It wasn't spoken, but it didn't need to be. Daniel Brooks made sure of that. He was the kind of man who smiled like every sentence was a performance, leaning just slightly too far into confidence as he approached our table. He looked at me first, then at Olivia, then back at me again like he was confirming a suspicion he already enjoyed. I remember him asking, loud enough for nearby tables to hear, what exactly I did that brought me into a place like this, and the laughter that followed wasn't explosive, it was casual, almost effortless, like I was an inside joke no one bothered to explain. Olivia didn't stop it. She didn't encourage it either. She just stood there with a polite smile that felt rehearsed, the kind of smile people use when they want peace more than truth. I didn't respond the way Daniel expected. I didn't argue. I didn't defend myself. I didn't even look away. I just observed, like I was collecting details instead of emotions. That's when I noticed something else in the room. Something quieter than the laughter but far more intentional. Robert Hayes, the CEO of Hayes International, had been watching me since the moment we arrived. Not in a casual way, but in a measured, deliberate way that didn't fit the atmosphere of the room. Most people in that room were trying to be seen, but he was trying to understand something. Olivia leaned slightly toward me at one point and whispered that we didn't need to stay long, that it was just a networking dinner, but her tone carried something heavier underneath it, something like relief mixed with distance. I nodded without arguing, because arguing would have only confirmed what everyone already seemed to believe about me in that moment. Daniel, however, wasn't finished. He circled back again, raising his glass slightly as he spoke, turning my presence into a kind of public curiosity, suggesting indirectly but clearly enough that I didn't belong in conversations like theirs. The laughter this time was sharper, more aware, like the room had decided on a role for me and was comfortable keeping it that way. I remember feeling the weight of it, not as humiliation exactly, but as classification, like I had been placed into a category without consent. Olivia finally looked at me then, just for a second, and I couldn't read what was in her expression. It wasn't anger, it wasn't pride, it was something more complicated, something that didn't reach language yet. And then everything shifted. Robert Hayes stood up from his table across the room, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the kind of calm that makes a room adjust itself without realizing it. Conversations lowered, glasses paused mid-air, and even Daniel's voice softened as if instinctively recognizing authority before it was announced. Robert walked toward our table slowly, and for the first time that evening, I felt the room paying attention to something other than itself. He stopped beside us, looked at Daniel briefly as if registering him, then turned his attention fully to me. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was expectant, like the room was waiting for a punchline it assumed it already understood. Instead, Robert Hayes spoke my name with a familiarity that didn't belong in this setting. And what he said next didn't raise his voice, didn't demand attention, but it rewrote the entire atmosphere in a single breath. The moment Robert Hayes said my name, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted in a way I cannot fully describe without sounding like time itself hesitated. Conversations that had been flowing seconds before suddenly lost momentum, like someone had quietly lowered the volume of reality. Daniel Brooks, who had been so confident just moments earlier, stopped speaking mid-sentence, his expression tightening as he tried to understand why the CEO of Hayes International was standing at our table addressing me instead of him or anyone else in his circle. Olivia was still beside me, but I could feel her uncertainty before I even looked at her. The way her posture subtly changed when she realized this interaction was not unfolding according to anything she had anticipated when she brought me here. Robert Hayes did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Instead, he looked at me with a calm focus that felt less like curiosity and more like confirmation, as if something he had been waiting on had finally arrived. Then he said it again, slower this time, not as a question, but as acknowledgement, using my full name with a familiarity that made the people around us exchange uneasy glances. I remember Daniel attempting a nervous laugh, trying to reclaim control of the moment by turning it into something casual, but no one followed him. The room had already decided this was no longer his moment. Robert finally turned slightly toward the group and then back to me and said, almost casually, that it had been a long time since I had attended one of these events, and that statement alone caused a ripple of confusion across the table because none of them had ever seen me at any previous event to begin with. Olivia looked at me then, really looked at me, and I could see the questions forming behind her eyes faster than she could organize them into words. Who exactly had she been standing beside all this time? And why did the CEO of a company like Hayes International speak to him like this? Daniel tried one last time to regain footing, asking Robert if there was some misunderstanding, implying that perhaps he was confusing me with someone else, but Robert did not even acknowledge the attempt. Instead, he reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and placed a small folded document on the table in front of me. Not dramatic, not performative, just deliberate. The paper itself did not look special, but the way every executive at the surrounding tables suddenly stopped pretending not to watch made it clear that whatever was written there carried weight. Robert continued speaking, his tone still controlled, explaining that the board had been waiting for my confirmation for weeks regarding a transition that required my final authorization, and the words landed in the space, like something heavy settling into place. I noticed Olivia shift slightly closer to me, her voice low when she asked what this was. But I did not answer immediately, because for the first time that evening, I was no longer reacting, I was evaluating the room the way I had always been trained to evaluate rooms like this. Daniel's expression had completely changed now, the confidence replaced with confusion and something closer to concern as he realized the direction this was heading was not something he could interrupt or redirect. Robert then looked at the entire table and stated plainly that the reason I had not been formally introduced earlier was because I had requested anonymity for the duration of certain internal operations, a statement that caused a visible reaction across the group because anonymity and authority rarely coexist in environments like this unless the authority is absolute. Olivia whispered my name again, but this time it carried a different tone, one that was no longer confident or dismissive, but uncertain in a way I had never heard from her before. I finally looked at her, not with anger, not with satisfaction, but with the same calm I had been holding since the moment Daniel first spoke, and I could see in her eyes that she was beginning to understand that the version of me she thought she had brought to this dinner was not the complete story. Robert stepped slightly back, giving me space without asking, and in that silence I felt every assumption in the room begin to reorganize itself around a truth none of them had been prepared to see. Then, in a voice steady enough to cut through the last remnants of confusion, he addressed me directly once more and said, "Sir, everything is ready when you are." And in that instant, I understood that the night was no longer about whether I belonged in this room, but about whether anyone else did. The silence after Robert Hayes called me sir did not fade. It expanded, filling every corner of the Westbridge Hotel ballroom like a pressure change that no one could ignore. I could feel it in the way conversations refused to restart naturally, in the way glasses were set down a little more carefully, in the way people who had been laughing only minutes ago suddenly found their attention fixed on something they could not categorize. Olivia was still beside me, but she was no longer standing with the same certainty she had carried when we arrived. I could sense her trying to reconstruct the situation in real time, as if she were mentally walking backward through every moment of our marriage searching for something she had missed. Daniel Brooks had completely lost his rhythm. He stood near his group of colleagues, his earlier confidence reduced to fragmented glances toward Robert Hayes and then toward me, as if looking at me directly for too long might reveal an answer he was not prepared to accept. Robert, however, remained calm, as if none of this disruption was unusual to him. He simply waited, giving the room time to settle into a new understanding it did not yet fully comprehend. Then he gestured subtly toward an adjacent table where two additional executives had been seated, and one of them immediately stood and approached, placing a tablet device on the table in front of Robert. I noticed the device screen glow faintly, displaying documents and charts I could not yet see clearly, but the reaction it triggered from the surrounding executives told me it was not ordinary dinner conversation material. Robert did not raise his voice when he spoke again. Instead, he explained that the current project under discussion had reached its final approval stage and required my formal confirmation before any external announcement could proceed. The phrasing alone caused a shift in the room because it implied authority over something none of them had been briefed on. Olivia finally broke her silence, asking in a low voice what kind of project this was, but Robert answered before I could, stating that it was a multi-region strategic acquisition initiative that had been in motion for over a year under confidential oversight. I watched Olivia's expression change as she processed that timeline, because a year meant this had existed long before tonight, long before this dinner, long before she had ever introduced me as anything other than her husband, who worked in something she had never fully asked about. Daniel attempted again to speak, this time more cautiously, asking whether there had been some administrative mistake, suggesting that perhaps I had been misidentified or incorrectly included in executive communication channels. But Robert finally turned his attention to him directly, and the temperature of the exchange dropped immediately. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He simply clarified that there was no mistake, and that every individual in the room had received clearance-based summaries that did not include full identities for security reasons. The word security changed everything in the atmosphere, because it redefined the conversation from social misunderstanding into structured hierarchy. I remained still, observing rather than reacting, because that had always been the habit when situations shifted into territory where emotion became irrelevant. Olivia leaned slightly closer again, but this time her voice carried something different, not confidence, not dismissal, but a kind of hesitation that suggested she was no longer sure where she stood in relation to me. She asked quietly why I had never mentioned any of this before, and for a brief moment I considered the question not as an accusation, but as something much simpler, a reflection of how completely separate my professional world had been from the version of life I had chosen to share at home. Robert then tapped the tablet once, and the screen changed, revealing what looked like a structured network of acquisitions, subsidiaries, and projected financial models spanning multiple states across the United States, including Illinois, Texas, and New York, all connected under a single operational framework that none of the people at the table had associated with me until now. I could feel the shift in perception around the table intensifying as individuals began quietly recalibrating their understanding of what I represented in that space. Daniel no longer looked like someone trying to challenge a misunderstanding. He looked like someone realizing he had been speaking to a context he never had access to. Olivia was still staring at me, but the expression in her eyes had changed again, now carrying something closer to disbelief mixed with recognition that the assumptions she had built about me were incomplete. Robert finally stepped back slightly, as if concluding the necessary part of the reveal, and said that my confirmation would activate the final phase of execution for the project, and that once completed, it would restructure an entire regional division under unified leadership. The word leadership hung in the air longer than anything else that had been said that evening. I slowly placed my glass down, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I understood the weight of what was being asked, and more importantly, I understood that everyone in the room now understood it too. For the first time since I had entered the ballroom, no one was laughing, no one was interrupting, no one was guessing. They were simply waiting, and in that waiting, I realized that the version of me they thought they had seen at the start of the night no longer existed in their understanding of the room. The room did not become louder after Robert Hayes finished speaking. It became heavier, as if every person inside the Westbridge Hotel ballroom had collectively realized they were standing on unstable ground. I could feel the shift not just in attention, but in understanding, the kind of understanding that arrives slowly and changes the shape of every assumption that came before it. Olivia was still beside me, but her presence now felt different, less certain, as if she was no longer sure whether she was standing next to her husband or next to someone she had never fully met. I could see it in the way her eyes kept returning to me, not with judgment anymore, but with recalculation, like she was trying to reconcile two versions of the same person that no longer aligned. Robert Hayes remained composed, his hands resting lightly near the tablet on the table, as though he had simply delivered a routine update rather than fundamentally altered the social structure of the room. Daniel Brooks, however, had completely abandoned any attempt at humor or control. His posture had shifted, his earlier confidence replaced with something closer to discomfort, the realization that every word he had spoken earlier now existed in a context that no longer supported him. A few of his colleagues leaned toward him, whispering quietly, but even their attempts at explanation felt incomplete, as if they were trying to rebuild meaning from fragments that no longer fit together. Robert finally spoke again, this time directing his attention across the table rather than at any single individual, stating that the final authorization process required only a verbal confirmation from me before the transition sequence could be executed. The phrase verbal confirmation sounded simple, but in the silence of that room it carried the weight of something far larger, something procedural, structured, and irreversible once initiated. Olivia finally broke her silence again, asking in a quieter tone what exactly would change if this transition moved forward, and Robert answered without hesitation, explaining that multiple regional divisions across 3 major cities in the United States would undergo immediate restructuring under consolidated executive oversight. I noticed the way the words settled into the room, because they were not abstract concepts to the people listening. They were implications tied directly to careers, influence, and hierarchy. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, no longer looking at me directly, instead staring at the table as if trying to locate a mistake that could restore the version of reality he preferred. I remained still, not because I was detached, but because I understood the importance of not reacting prematurely in environments where perception itself was part of the structure. Olivia leaned closer once more, her voice lower now, asking why none of this had ever come up in our conversations, and the question carried something different this time, not accusation, but recognition of distance she had never measured before. I could have answered in many ways, but the truth was simple. There are parts of a life that do not translate easily into dinner table conversations, especially when those parts are built around responsibility rather than visibility. Robert then tapped the tablet again, and the display changed to a series of internal communications, timelines, and authorization logs, each one stamped and verified through multiple security layers, confirming that what was being presented was not theoretical but operational. I watched Olivia's expression change again as she saw the scale of it, her eyes scanning the information in a way that suggested she was beginning to understand that what she had considered a stable narrative of our life together had only ever been one layer of a much larger structure. Daniel finally spoke again, but his voice lacked the earlier sharpness, replaced instead by caution, as he asked whether there had been any prior indication that this level of authority was attached to my role, and Robert simply responded that discretion had been a core requirement of the entire framework from its inception. The word discretion lingered in the air longer than anything else, because it explained absence, silence, and separation all at once. Olivia looked at me again, this time with something closer to uncertainty than disbelief, and I could tell she was searching for continuity, for a moment in our shared history that would make this version of events feel less distant from the life she thought she knew. Robert stepped slightly to the side, allowing space at the table as if concluding his part in the exchange, and stated calmly that once my confirmation was given, all pending operational adjustments would proceed within 24 hours across all designated regions in the United States. The specificity of the timeline brought the moment into sharper focus, because it was no longer abstract authority being discussed, it was immediate action. I slowly looked across the table, not at Robert, not at Daniel, but at the room itself, at the people who had spent the evening assigning meaning to my presence without understanding its foundation. Olivia followed my gaze, and for the first time that night, she did not speak, she simply waited. And in that silence, I realized that every assumption in the room was now suspended, waiting on a single decision that would determine how every person here would remember this night moving forward. The silence in the ballroom had reached a point where even the smallest movement felt amplified, like every breath carried meaning that no one wanted to misinterpret. I stood there with the weight of the entire room, waiting on something as simple as a confirmation, yet nothing about that moment felt simple at all. Olivia had not spoken for several seconds now, and in that quiet, I could feel her presence beside me shifting between certainty and doubt, as if she were trying to find the version of me she believed she knew and realizing it did not fully align with the reality unfolding in front of her. Robert Hayes remained still, his attention steady but not impatient, the way someone waits when they already know the outcome but respects the process anyway. Daniel Brooks, on the other hand, was no longer attempting to mask anything. The earlier confidence that had carried him through jokes and remarks had dissolved completely, replaced by a stillness that came from the realization that the structure of authority in the room was no longer something he could interpret or influence. I could feel eyes on me from multiple directions, not just from our table, but from surrounding executives who had begun to quietly adjust their understanding of what this entire evening represented. I looked down briefly at the table, not because I was uncertain, but because I was organizing the timeline in my mind, everything that had led to this point, everything that had been kept separate for reasons that now felt more visible than ever. Olivia finally broke the silence, her voice softer than before, asking if I was going to tell her what this actually meant, and the question was not framed as pressure, but as a moment of realization that something fundamental had been outside her awareness for far longer than she had assumed. I turned slightly toward her, and for a moment I could see the version of our life she had been holding on to, the version built on shared routines, simple explanations, and assumptions that had never required deeper examination. But standing in this room, surrounded by people who measured value in entirely different terms, I understood how incomplete that version had always been. Robert Hayes finally spoke again, not to me directly this time, but to the space between all of us, stating that once confirmation was given, the restructuring sequence would not be reversible without initiating an entirely new executive review cycle, a detail that shifted the atmosphere again because it introduced finality rather than suggestion. Daniel moved slightly in his seat, as if the word irreversible had physically changed the temperature around him, and for the first time he did not look at me with skepticism or challenge, but with something closer to recognition that he had been operating in a space he never fully understood. I took a slow breath, not because I needed courage, but because I understood that every person in this room was now interpreting silence as decision and decision as consequence. Olivia's hand shifted slightly near mine, not touching, but close enough that I could feel the hesitation in her movement, the question she was not yet ready to voice. I finally looked at Robert and gave a simple acknowledgement, not dramatic, not performative, just a single confirmation that carried the weight of everything that had been built behind the scenes for years leading up to this night. The effect was immediate but quiet, like a system accepting input it had been waiting for, and Robert gave a small nod as if verifying that the final condition had been met. Around the room, people began to subtly adjust posture again, but this time it was not confusion, it was recalibration. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back slightly as if the tension holding him upright had finally released, replaced by the understanding that his role in this moment had ended long before he realized it. Olivia turned her head toward me fully now, her expression no longer searching for explanation, but trying to reconcile emotion with information that no longer fit into the structure she had built in her mind. I could see questions forming in her eyes, not just about tonight, but about every moment before it that now carried new meaning in hindsight. Robert stepped slightly away from the table and spoke into a discreet communication device, confirming execution protocol in a calm, controlled voice, and within seconds I could see subtle movement across the room as other executives received silent notifications and began responding without drawing attention. The ballroom itself had not changed physically, but the energy inside it had shifted into something far more structured, as if the environment had transitioned from social gathering to operational confirmation. Olivia finally spoke again, asking quietly what would happen after this moment, and I told her the truth as simply as I could, that nothing would happen suddenly, but everything would begin to align differently over time. She did not respond immediately, and I did not push for one, because I could already see the realization settling in her expression, that the life she thought she had understood was connected to systems and decisions she had never been part of until this night. Daniel stood slowly from his seat, not abruptly, but with the careful awareness of someone who now understood that leaving quietly was the only remaining option available to him. And as he stepped back from the table, he offered no further words. Robert Hayes looked at me one final time before stepping away as well, not in dismissal, but in acknowledgement that his role in the moment was complete. And as the space around me gradually returned to a fragile kind of stillness, I realized that the most significant change was not in the room, but in how every person in it now understood that what they had witnessed was not an interruption of their evening, but the true beginning of everything that had been building long before they arrived. The moment the last wave of notifications quietly moved through the ballroom, the atmosphere did not return to what it had been before, because there was no version of the night that could now be reversed back into ignorance. It simply continued forward under a different understanding. I remained standing near the table for a few seconds longer than anyone else, not because I needed time to process what had happened, but because I was observing how quickly human perception adapts when authority is no longer uncertain. Conversations around the room restarted in fragments, not as a unified return to normal, but as cautious attempts to rebuild social structure around what had just been revealed. Olivia was still beside me, but she had stopped trying to speak. Her silence was no longer defensive or confused. It was reflective, as if she was replaying every interaction we had ever shared and reassigning meaning to details she had previously dismissed. I could see it in her expression, not shock anymore, but recalibration, the kind that happens when someone realizes the framework they used to understand a person was incomplete. Daniel Brooks had already stepped away from the table entirely, disappearing into the larger crowd with the careful urgency of someone trying to reduce their visibility without drawing attention. No one stopped him, because at that point, no one needed to. Robert Hayes had also begun to distance himself, not abruptly, but with the same controlled precision he had carried throughout the evening. Before leaving, he gave me a final nod, not as a superior, not as a subordinate, but as someone acknowledging completion of a necessary step in a larger process that extended beyond the room. Once he disappeared into the flow of executives near the far end of the ballroom, the center of gravity in the room subtly shifted away from our table. I noticed how people no longer looked at me with curiosity or speculation, but with restraint, as if recalculating the acceptable distance of observation. Olivia finally spoke again, her voice quiet, asking not about the project anymore, but about why I had never allowed her to see this side of my life. The question was not sharp, it was careful, and I could tell she was trying to understand the separation between what we had shared and what I had withheld. I looked at her for a moment without answering immediately, because the answer was not simple, nor was it something that could be compressed into a single explanation that would satisfy everything she was feeling at once. Instead, I told her that some responsibilities exist in spaces that are intentionally separated from personal life, not out of secrecy for its own sake, but out of structure, necessity, and the nature of the work itself. She did not respond right away, but I could see that she was trying to place that explanation into the context of every moment she had known me, comparing what she now understood with what she had assumed before. Around us, the ballroom continued its slow return to form, but it was not the same form it had been before. Conversations were more measured, laughter more controlled, movements more deliberate. People were no longer performing confidence in the same way they had been earlier in the evening. Instead, there was awareness, and awareness changes behavior more effectively than instruction ever could. A server passed by with fresh glasses, but no one at our table reached for anything. The physical setting remained unchanged, yet everything within it had shifted in interpretation. Olivia finally lowered her gaze briefly, as if absorbing the weight of everything she had just learned, and when she looked back up, her expression carried something more grounded than confusion, something closer to acceptance of scale rather than certainty of understanding. I could tell she was not processing me as the same person she had arrived with, but she was also not rejecting what she saw. She was simply adjusting her perspective in real time. After a long pause, she asked if this was something that would change how we lived moving forward, and I told her honestly that nothing would need to change suddenly, but that she would likely begin to see differences in how time, responsibility, and distance interact within my life. That answer did not resolve everything, but it was enough for the moment to settle between us without tension. In the background, the final conversations of executives began to shift toward departure. Chairs quietly moving, subtle acknowledgments exchanged, the kind of controlled exit that follows events where hierarchy has been silently reaffirmed. I remained where I was until the surrounding motion began to thin, and when I finally turned slightly toward Olivia again, I could see that she was no longer searching for a version of me that fit into her previous understanding. She was beginning to accept that the version she had known was only part of a larger structure she had never been exposed to. As the room continued its gradual dispersal, I realized that the most important change of the night was no longer about authority or confirmation, but about perception itself, because once perception shifts at this level, everything that follows is no longer about revelation, but adjustment. The ballroom was already beginning to thin out by the time I fully registered how quiet everything had become around me. Not the kind of silence that arrives suddenly, but the kind that builds gradually as a space empties itself of purpose. Conversations had softened into farewells, chairs had shifted back into place, and the remaining guests moved with the controlled rhythm of people who understood that whatever had happened here tonight was not something to comment on openly. I stood near the same table where everything had started, yet it no longer felt like a starting point. It felt like a reference point, something people would mentally return to when trying to explain a shift they could not fully describe. Olivia was still beside me, but she had changed in a way that was not visible in any dramatic sense. It was subtle, internal, a recalibration that could only be recognized over time rather than in a single moment. She finally broke the silence. Not with questions about the company or the executives, but with something much simpler, asking if everything I had just confirmed would change the way I was at home. The question carried no accusation, only uncertainty shaped by reevaluation, and I took a moment before answering because I understood that what she was really asking was whether the version of me she had known would still exist in the same form moving forward. I told her that nothing essential about who I was would change, but that she would begin to see more clearly the structure around the responsibilities I carried, and that clarity often changes perception more than reality changes behavior. She nodded slowly, not in agreement or disagreement, but in acceptance that she was still processing something larger than a single conversation could resolve. Around us, the last of the executives were now leaving the ballroom in small groups, their movements measured, their conversations subdued, as if everyone understood that the real conclusion of the evening had already taken place earlier and everything after that was simply transition. Robert Hayes had already departed without drawing attention, leaving behind only the residual awareness of authority that no longer needed physical presence to be recognized. Daniel Brooks was no longer visible, having blended into the exit flow of attendees, his earlier confidence fully replaced by the quiet withdrawal of someone who had learned more in one evening than he had expected to learn in an entire professional cycle. I remained where I was for a moment longer, not because I was waiting for anything, but because I was observing how quickly environments reassign meaning once hierarchy is clarified. Olivia finally adjusted her posture slightly, looking around the now thinning room, and I could sense that she was beginning to separate the social version of the evening from the structural reality that had unfolded beneath it. She asked one more question, quieter than the rest, about why I had chosen not to share any of this earlier, and I understood that this was not about secrecy in the way people usually assume, but about the natural separation between professional responsibility and personal life, when both exist at different scales of intensity. I explained that some parts of a life are not hidden out of avoidance, but out of function, because introducing them without necessity often distorts the balance of the life being built outside of them. She listened without interrupting, and for the first time that evening, I saw her fully accept that the absence of information was not equivalent to deception, but rather separation of context she had never been asked to interpret. The ballroom lights seemed slightly softer now as cleaning staff began to move discreetly at the edges of the room, restoring order without disrupting the final conversations of departing guests. I could feel the night transitioning into its final phase, where events stop unfolding and start being stored as memory. Olivia and I began walking slowly toward the exit together, not in silence filled with tension, but in silence filled with processing. the kind that does not require immediate resolution. As we stepped out of the ballroom into the quieter corridor of the hotel, the noise of the evening faded completely behind us, replaced by a calmer atmosphere that felt distant from what had just occurred. She finally spoke again, saying that she needed time to understand everything she had seen, and I told her that understanding was not something that needed to be completed in a single moment, but something that would naturally unfold as perspective adjusted. We reached the elevator, and as the doors opened, I could see her reflection beside me, not confused anymore, but thoughtful in a way that suggested she was beginning to see me not as a changed person, but as a more complete one than she had previously understood. The elevator doors closed, and in that enclosed silence, the weight of the evening finally settled into something calmer, not resolved, not concluded, but placed into context. And as the numbers above the door slowly descended, I realized that the true shift of the night was not in what had been revealed to others, but in how quietly everything had been redefined without the need for further explanation.